Welcome to another vintage headphone review. GREQ is your host today, and I will be reviewing the Sennheiser HD540, the HD560 Ovation, and the HD250 Linear. As these models are all from the late 1980s, it's expected that the earpads of these headphones are not useful anymore. While that's the case for the 560, the 540 and 250's pads are not just present, but still in near full working order. 35-year-old pleather pads that are still functional. Most modern pleather pads barely last 2 years. What happened? All suspension straps are in good working order, but the pleather coating on the Ovations has mostly peeled off. Other than that, they're all fine. The build quality appears to be superb. Even the cables, which seem to be a weak point as they're so thin, are completely fine. These headphones, like most of Sennheiser's enthusiast headphones up to the modern 600 series, are almost fully modular and can be taken apart without tools and serviced at home. Even the cups are mounted to the headband with a universal ball and socket joint that can be easily popped out for quick replacement. Things do get a bit more scary if we go inside the headphone and take a look at the drivers. I won't go into the 250 Linear again, as there's a stray voice wire that I don't want to go near again, but the HD540 and 560 is another matter. Also, all three of the drivers look almost identical from what I've seen, and they all disassemble in roughly the same way. Even the plastic baffle clips holding the HD560 driver in place are much smaller than those found on the HD600 series, so the drivers are much easier to remove or replace. There is a significantly reduced chance of snapping the plastic here, since much less pressure is required to bend these tabs, although I found that simply bending the entire baffle frame a little helps too, since it is impossible to break without extreme force. The drivers look great, and are obvious precursors to the HD580 and 600 series. Unlike the modern drivers, Sennheiser has cut a hole in the middle of the dome, in the middle of the driver, and covered it with an ultra-thin, porous fabric. I think they were trying to do two main things here. First, to reduce distortion, as the dynamic driver dome is typically where the most unwanted resonances occur, so removing it almost entirely is one way to do it, just like the HD800's ring radiator. Secondly, it reduces the driver's internal chamber pressure, which in turn means less air resistance for a faster motor response, which should allow for higher detail retrieval. It's likely any extra weight gained from the layer of fabric and glue was a welcome trade-off against the internal air pressure. This is also something you may have seen on some vintage loudspeakers, although the thin fabric dust caps on those large woofers would have actually provided significantly less weight. The build gets an easy 9 out of 10. Things get tricky when we analyze the sound. You have to remember, at the time these headphones were made, headphones were still regarded as accessories by most hi-fi enthusiasts, and as such, they would be plugged into large speaker amps, which had the benefit of analog tone controls or simple EQ. Brace yourself. Here's a graph of the HD560 Ovation. There's no escaping the absolutely Himalayan treble peak, which sits 10 decibels per hour over the vast majority of the mid-range. Does it sound subjectively bad? Yes and no. Does it sound objectively bad? Not in a million years. The tuning presents orchestral and classical music in an extremely live and realistic way. The timbre feels alive and fully present. For a high level of realistic instrument detail, you have to look at extremely expensive modern flagships or electrostatic headphones, and even then, there's no guarantee of acquiring the same timbral characteristics or staging as this headphone. I enjoyed these most through my Fosi SK01, which allowed me to give a subtle bass boost and treble reduction, the kind of tone control that would have been taken for granted in the 80s. Compared to the historical king of classical, the AKG K501, if the 501 is like sitting in a large concert hall somewhere closer to the middle of the hall, the HD560 Ovation is like sitting 5 to 10 rows from the front. It's like you want to feel a bit more of the sound pressure from the orchestra. Both are classical masters, just different. Unfortunately, sub-bass volume is still lacking. While it can take a decent amount of tone correction, it will never be authoritative or substantial like modern dynamics or planars. A simple tone correction can only take the bass so far, so if you switch to some modern electronic music, for example, it will quickly become bloated before the sub-bass reaches a normal level, leaving some tracks sounding a bit too thin or old-school neutral. I can happily give the sound quality an 8 out of 10 or a 9 if you only listen to classical. The HD250 linear is decidedly very close to its namesake. In my experience, as long as most of the tone stays within a range of 10 decibels, it will largely be perceived as being objectively good, as long as any big dips and peaks within that range are in the correct places. For its age, the HD250 fits this category. On its own, the graph doesn't look like much, but there are some interesting points that are easier to make if we overlay a graph of the biodynamic DT770 Pro. Something I've noticed after listening to and measuring hundreds of headphones is that what looks like and sounds neutral or enjoyable in an open back headphone should not be directly compared to closed backs. So, while an open back will often sound better the flatter it measures with a slight downward slope, it's not always the case with closed backs. There are some tuning tricks that can actually make a closed back headphone sound bigger and better. So let's talk about these correct dips and peaks. For example, the dip between 2 to 300 Hz looks like a big problem on paper, but what this does in both the DT770 and HD250 linear is that it largely removes any possibility of the bass bloating and bleeding into the lower mids. This tuning trick also does a great job of improving instrument separation and general clarity, and as described, the sub-bass is truly almost linear, with no significant drop-off all the way down to 20 Hz, with only the slightest roll-off down to 10. Unlike many frequency response databases, all my graphs go down to 10 Hz. This is why there are many headphones that exist that have excellent sub-bass extension, which often provides a greater sense of scale and body to the sound, compared to headphones which crap out just before 20 Hz. Like even some very expensive modern planars. I don't want to hide this information because it tells us a lot about the character of the headphone. The bass on this headphone is awesome, not just for a closed back or for a vintage Sennheiser, but by all modern standards. It's actually borderline overbearing at times. I'm even tempted to turn it down a few decibels with some electronic music. The first thing, however, most people will do is turn down the treble. With the very best mastering, this likely won't be an issue, but on tracks with infamously piercing treble like Creep by Radiohead or Bangarang by Skrillex, the HD250 will swiftly punish your ears. The mid-range is the part of this headphone I am most conflicted about. It's also the hardest part to change with simple tone correction. The slow rise all the way up to around 2.5 kHz does some weird things to most genres, making vocals and instruments sound a bit thin and in your face in some modern genres like classic rock, pop, and electronic. Classical music is, however, more than acceptable. If you're looking for a good way to listen to classical music in relative isolation, this does a fair job. Then there's metal, orchestral rock, and progressive rock. It didn't matter what I threw at this headphone. And the more power and volume you give it, the better it got. Freak on a Leash by Korn just sounded musical. System of a Down's Dreaming was extremely articulate and energetic. Hysteria by Muse sounded almost live. Disowned Ink by Serj Tankian had almost no congestion. Almost all headphones fail this test. BFG Division by Mick Gordon was just visceral and only improved with a small, tiny extra bass boost. The rise in the mids does some amazing things to these genres, puts the guitars and vocals up front and creates a more live sound, something very difficult to achieve in a closed back headphone. Since there's only a limited range of genres where this headphone truly stands above the rest and requires some careful, small tone corrections, I can only give it a 7 out of 10. But when the synergy is there, it reaches an easy subjective 8 out of 10, maybe even a 9 in some cases. For me personally, the HD540 stands out of this crowd here. With only a small treble peak, around 9 kHz, and an almost entirely neutral presentation, they are similarly expansive and as musical as the HD560 Ovation, but without that sense of being pushed up front, being force-fed all the detail and emotion directly to your brain. The HD540 clearly falls closer to the objective middle ground, and is a competent historical genre master and a true flagship model in my opinion. So you can expect it to perform well until you try anything with extreme sub-bass requirements. There are, however, 3 main points I would like to make about this headphone. Firstly, there are 2 versions of the HD540 and the earpads. The older version is a convoluted sandwich of various foams surrounded by fabric with a layer of plastic in the middle and finished off with a layer of pleather on the area of the pad that touches your head. These earpads here are the later version with thicker foam, and they are fully surrounded in velour. The earlier earpad version provides a much thinner sound with focus on the treble. The later version, this one, is by far the more balanced version. Secondly, these were considered the flagship model before the HD580 and the 600 series. So compared to the HD580, 600 and 650, the HD540 has a grander sense of space and musical performance at the cost of slightly high fatigue. I have always considered the HD600 series as the most average headphone ever made. I don't mean average sound quality or anything like that, but that everything about them is as close to precisely in the middle of all aspects of sound presentation. Bass is neither too dry or tight or too loose and boomy. Treble is neither too harsh or too soft. Soundstage is neither too small or extra large. Timbre is neither hyper-realistic or lackluster. These are the qualities that I believe give the 600 series its legendary status, as they try to do as little extra as possible, which is a grand achievement in of itself. The HD540 is different. It is more focused on the performance at the cost of sub-bass volume, some light treble fatigue, and a timbre that leans more on the side of exaggerated realism. And none of these qualities are right or wrong, or good or bad. They're all just different flavors that different people will enjoy or appreciate. Sennheiser's long history of producing world-class headphones certainly peaked strongly in the late 80s. This series is a clear and significant step above their early 80s series in terms of musicality and versatility, but a slight departure from a long tradition of seeking subjective neutrality. With the right tone corrections, none of these headphones will disappoint most modern headphone enjoyers, as long as you're looking for a specific sound for a specific genre. Fairly decent aftermarket earpads can be found for all 3 headphones, and I don't see any reason why any of them wouldn't keep working for another 35 years. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.